If you've had any contact with the outside world in the last month, you've probably heard the name Bruno the Bear. Bruno the Bear is a bear who the conservation agency has tagged and is tracking. Bruno is making his multi-state journey. He started in Wisconsin and he's worked his way down into Missouri and recently made his way into St. Charles, to where they did make the decision to tranquilize and relocate him to a less populated area. But Bruno is quite the celebrity, including having a Facebook page with over 150,000 followers. So Bruno is quite a legend in his own time, for sure. But what a lot of folks don't know is that Joplin also has a famous bear in their history. Most people who find themselves over here on the west side of town at Schifferdecker Park will either be here for picnicking or skateboarding or disc golfing or swimming or the museum or even ball golf. But really the history of Schifferdecker Park is much more in-depth than just those simple activities. Over 110 years ago, Charles Schifferdecker actually bought what was then a dairy farm, and in 1909 he actually leased 10 of those acres to a couple of local businessmen who then took that property and turned it into an amusement park. Early on, animals were a key piece of this amusement park. They had Texas Longhorns, they had wolves, they had bears, they had an alligator wrangler actually who had 200 alligators, which is a story for another time. But one of the bears that they had came to the park in 1920, and her name was Betty, and Betty was a bit of an escape artist. She didn't quite enjoy staying inside of her enclosure, and that created some local lore and legend that is still shared to this day. A couple of Betty's escapes were quite interesting. Her first escape was just simply climbing over the back of her enclosure and out into the park, where she was quickly gathered back up, and they put some electric fence on the back of her enclosure to hopefully prevent that from happening again. But the second escape was a little more interesting. The second escape involved Mother Nature, and the pond in the front of her enclosure had frozen over just enough to bear her weight, and she was able to sneak out, and as she snuck out, she found her way right back here to the intersection of 7th and Schifferdecker, to where she found herself a stray dog to play with, and they were there in the intersection romping around and playing, and obviously that led to several phone calls to the park superintendent, who then also had to come and get Betty back into her enclosure. And the story goes that he brought a wooden paddle and gave her some spankings and guided her back to her enclosure. There's another story that in 1943 a soldier from Camp Crowder thought that, you know what would be a great idea? I'm just going to climb into the bear enclosure and just pet Betty. What could go wrong, right? Well, as he approached Betty, Betty gave a little growl that said, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea, which unfortunately the soldier didn't heed, and although Betty didn't do anything, the other bear in the enclosure did chase the soldier out of the enclosure and into the arms of his friends, and they say that the soldier learned a lesson that day that it's much better to observe the bears from a distance. Here, just off of hole 10, you can see just where this would have been where Betty's den enclosure would have been, just here across from the museum, just off of the tee box for, like I said, for 10. But what I want to show you is really right here. Betty Bear, 1920 to 1952, a long life given to entertaining visitors at Schifferdecker Park. So here where her den enclosure was, they have a little memorial to remember her by. So hopefully you enjoyed this little bit of local history and learned something. Maybe not, maybe you already knew, but to actually kind of see these sites that are local, and with Bruno the Bear in the news, and to hear a little bit about our own little bear story, I just thought it was an interesting time to come and share the story of Betty.